All right. Hi, everyone. How are you all doing? Hey. Yeah, cool. All right, welcome to Weaving the Net, Dredge, and Yarn Spinner. So, I'm John. Hi, I'm the director of Secret Lab, which has been running for nearly 18 years, my God. And I'm an author of books, and I'm a PhD in computer science, and I'm also the original and lead developer of Yarn Spinner, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit. I'm from Hobart, where it's cold and windy and there's a thriving art scene, and now I'm in Wellington, where it's cold and windy and there's a thriving art scene, but all your clocks are off by 2 hours. Today, we're going to be talking about how Dredge and its narrative design works. We'll do a deep dive into the dialogue system used in Dredge, how Dredge used off-the-shelf open source narrative tools, and also how to use stuff like this in your own games as well. So, I'm curious, raise your hand if you don't know what Dredge is. I'm very curious. Not a single hand, one hand from the back. Fantastic. Well then, that's Dredge. You know about it already. But for people watching on the recording, it was released in 2023. It is a narrative adventure game. It is an eldritch fishing simulator, and it is the first game from the studio Black Salt Games, and was all published by Team 17, which is great. People liked it. People thought it was pretty good. It won a whole bunch of awards, was nominated for even more, and generally it was considered to be an indie darling. In terms of player count, the numbers, the concurrents are still really high right now today, even though it is a single-player game from over 2 years ago. Now, Dredge used Yarn Spinner. Yarn Spinner is an open source dialogue tool that I helped run, which I think is pretty good, and a bunch of people agree, including these people. It's currently being used by thousands of games, many of which are very highly awarded and beloved, including many games have won the Independent Game Festival Grand Prize, and a whole bunch of so this is a tiny tangent. The one on the bottom right-hand corner turns out is a YouTuber who we had no knowledge of, but has millions of followers because, of course, how that works. And basically came out of nowhere going, I made a game based on my series, and then suddenly the number of people who have played a game using Yarn Spinner shot up into the tens or hundreds of thousands just overnight. So, why am I on the stage talking about Dredge? Well, out of nowhere, a few years ago, Joel Mason from Black Salt DM'd me going, hey, Yarn Spinner is broken on Switch. And this was a surprise to me that one, Dredge was using Yarn Spinner, and two, Yarn Spinner was working on the Switch, because this was so soon after we began development of Yarn Spinner that someone was already using it. So great, cool. So we fixed it. We said, hey, cool, by the way, your game looks kind of nice. And then, one thing led to another, and then they shipped, and then they won a whole bunch of awards. So, you draw the dots. So today we're going to be talking about the narrative structure. We're talking about the delivery mechanisms that Dredge makes use of. We'll talk about how Yarn Spinner integrates into the gameplay systems, how the dialogue presenters inside Dredge are configured and used, and also how this whole thing is done to support localization. Now, a dialogue system is deceptively complex. You wouldn't write your own renderer or your own sound system for your game, but a number of game developers go, well, how hard could it be? I'll just write my lines in a spreadsheet, or maybe a JSON file if I'm feeling spicy. But that means that you're not prepared for a whole bunch of consequent issues, like localization. How do you handle branching? How do you handle assets tied to lines? How do you handle events tied to objects tied to lines? How do you handle Unicode issues related to multiple languages? State restoration, it gets wacky. So, let's talk about the narrative structure of Dredge. To recap, because basically it sounds like everyone here has played a little bit of Dredge, which is great. You control a boat. You travel around islands, and while you're traveling around islands, you do fishing, you find objects, and you avoid various kinds of danger. You then return home, you sell those fish, you interact with characters on the island, and you upgrade your boat, and the loop goes on like that. Each island has a different theme and different characters. Also, there's horrors. Now, there's a whole bunch of different characters on those islands, and they want specific things, items found and brought back, they want fish caught, and so the story of the game is told almost exclusively through dialogue, although there is a bunch of stuff that is delivered through in-world events like finding items and reading books and collecting notes, but all the dialogue is done on the islands. Now, as a game that was critically praised for its narrative, it's kind of ironic because the goal was to not make a dialogue or narrative-driven game. Because, as Joel has said to me, the plan was like, go super light on the dialogue, and if there has to be text, make it informative or instructional because players don't like reading text. So the plan was that it was going to be just a spooky fishing game, and then they would tell the player, go and do some stuff. So they slapped some placeholder dialogue in there. And the dialogue was actually extremely, because the plan was to not have a story, players thought there was a story implied by the vagueness of the text, and they responded really well to it. And because they thought there was a story as a result. And so Black Salt leaned into it. And then they got nominated for a Hugo, a Nebula, and a BAFTA. So I don't know what lesson to draw from this. Don't try and tell a story and you'll be, no. So people like the story. The Guardian said it was tremendous. PC Gamer said, what a story. Destructoid said it was weak. GameHub said it was evocative. The original narrative plan was that the islands in the game are the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. So that's, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that kind of stuff. And this is kind of reflected by the characters that you meet on those islands. So, for example, the fishmonger on Greater Marrow, who's the first island that you arrive at, is depressed. The researcher on Stellar Basin is convinced that if I could find one more piece of data, then I'd be able to fix it. Now, this was not carried through towards the end, but it did help shape the initial structure and a guided character creation. It basically gave them a template to start working from. So tropes can be really, really good as long as you aren't only doing the tropes. The writing process for Dredge was pretty straightforward and probably pretty reflective of what a lot of people in this room have done, which is that the dialogue was written in Microsoft Word and then transferred into the game in the form of the game's Yarn scripts. So Yarn Spinner basically takes the form of you write plain text documents, which are just screenplays with a bit of programming sprinkled in. And so it was quite straightforward for them to copy and paste the text in. But during the later development and as they were iterating on the game, it turned out to be easier to just edit the dialogue in place in those Yarn scripts. And in fact, by the time they got to the stage of making DLCs, the writing was just happening in the Yarn scripts directly. They weren't doing a stage where they did the writing and the planning and then transferred it into the game for narrative integration. They were just doing it in narrative integration from the jump. So they would write the placeholder text for before and after an in-game event takes place. They'd implement the game's event logic, and then they'd finally replace it with final content. And this style of iteration made it extremely fast to assemble a good story without having to have a huge process. Let's talk about the delivery mechanisms that Dredge makes use of to get this story over to the player. So the majority of the narrative text, as I mentioned, is dialogue, and that's written by Yarn Spinner, and that's only delivered to the player when the player is docked. And that's actually really important because it means that the player is guaranteed to be in a relatively safe environment. You're never going to be distracted by the horrors when you're trying to talk to a character at the island. They set themselves some guidelines for successful dialogue. So no more than 4 or 5 boxes of text in a row to avoid overwhelming the player with too much content. Make sure that each box is no more than 3 or 4 lines of dialogue, like lines of text rather, because UI side limitations. But also, crucially, every piece of text shown to the player, and this is not just dialogue, it's also found objects as well, should do at least 2 of 3 things. Tell the player what they're doing, advance the story or build the world, or be creepy. Everything must do at least 2 of those things. It's okay for something to not be creepy as long as it is both giving the player instruction and building the world. And this basically enforces a highly economical style of writing. Everything you're seeing is going to basically build this out. There's also quests in the game composed of steps. Steps are advanced in a few different ways. You can get fish or get items. They can be manually set complete in dialogue, or they can be unlocked by a thing called the world phase. And the world phase is a global variable that tracks how far through the story, the fairly linear story, you are. So, for example, a quest that can be completed by acquiring a fish is the very, very first quest, which is go get me an aberrant fish. And when you come back, then the fishmonger is very happy with you. Quests can also be failable. There is a quest midway through the game where a character boards your ship and they just appear as inventory. If you collide with stuff, you can lose stuff overboard. That includes the guy who's on board your ship. And so it's possible to lose him overboard and then arrive at your destination going, yeah, he didn't make it. And so failable quests as a direct consequence of player interaction, it feels like it's your fault and you get it. And the world phase, as it advances, unlocks more dangerous world events, more dialogue choices, and it represents overall plot progression. Not all of the dialogue, not all the narrative is in Yarn. So, for example, there's messages in a bottle, there's quest descriptions, and there's books. And the progression, as I mentioned, can be controlled by Yarn, but the text comes from elsewhere. So, with all that said, let's see it in action. So I'm going to show you the opening moments of the game after the cutscene. Here is the introduction conversation with the mayor, in which we're basically being told what to do. Here's the setting of the world, and so we have lines, we have choices, we can make a choice, and based on what we have selected, we get different content. Fairly standard dialogue stuff. After that, we get kicked out to the dock where we get a menu. So behind it, you can see this is actually the source code to what we just saw. Now, this is actually your first taste of Yarn's been a script, possibly, where you can see the lines of dialogue, they're just written like pieces of screenplay. But there's also additional things that control the logic of it. So you can see words like set bool variable, that, as you might imagine, sets a Boolean variable in Dredge, and that is used for controlling the availability of content. It's used for controlling quests. You can see options as well. So halfway down that screenshot, you can see that there's little arrows written in purple, and those are how you describe in Yarn Spinner how to have multiple options. And also, at the end of several lines, there's little hashtags, and they carry metadata about the line that various systems make use of. Every line has a line ID, and that's used for localization, which we'll get to later on. So all of this information, which is fairly compact, gets delivered to a variety of systems called dialogue presenters. So a dialogue presenter is a component that reads dialogue from your Yarn script and sends it into the game. So by content, what I mean is lines and options and commands. So all three of those things we just saw in that screenshot. Let's look at lines. So a line is, well, it's a line of dialogue. Yarn Spinner will take a line ID, send it into the game. The game then goes, okay, I'll go fetch the appropriate piece of text required for that line ID. And that's how we do localization. So basically all Yarn Spinner is doing is saying line ID, and it's up to your game to find the appropriate text, which means that you don't have to be locked into a specific localization system. But the dialogue presenter was also in charge of processing the text for visual elements. So, for example, it's used for controlling the portrait that we see here, as well as making sure that interaction is appropriately timed. So lines have character names. This is both shown on screen, but also controls the portrait. There's usually only one portrait per character, but there are some exceptions. The scientist in the Iron Rig DLC has a story where basically his appearance changes over the course of his story, and so there's systems in place to make sure that the appropriate thing at the right time is used for controlling his portrait. Now, one of the things you might have noticed in that mayor intro is that different words get given different colors. So really, really common thing in dialogue systems, but there was a really specific thing that I haven't seen done very often in other games. You'll notice that we have like welcome to C0 Greater Marrow, close C0. So it's like old forum style BB code. And again, jagged rocks, which have the C2 tag. So a lot of people, when they build systems like this, they go, yeah, cool, one of them will be blue and the other one will be red. And that was the original plan for Dredge. There were going to be hex codes, and that way you could encode the color into it. But then it was decided that the risk of typos during localization was too high, because the entire line gets translated, and that includes all this additional content. And there was a real risk that people would translate or make typos or otherwise get in the way of this. So it was simpler to have a generic color 0 and color 1, and then just remember which one you needed to use. Because this effectively turns the color stuff into a semantic color system, it can be overridden, and that created an unexpected accessibility bonus. Because if you're only ever using color 0 to emphasize a word, and you're only ever using color 1 to represent positive things, you can expose that to your players and let them customize it. Suddenly, the idea of using color to control highlight colors is not an issue for people with color blindness, because they can control it. They have a lot of, it's really, really good. I don't see this happen very often. So, There's other metadata on the lines as well. Characters in Dredge are not voiced, it's not a voiced-over game, but they do make noise because it does help set the overall emotional tone of the line. So lines have certain hashtags that trigger what the team called paralinguistics. It turns out this is a real term, and it's vocalizations like ah, and and that kind of stuff. Stuff that is not really a word, but does form part of the spoken content. And so the presence of this hashtag at the end of this line by the mayor causes the appropriate sound to be played for this line, for this character. So a takeaway from this, markup is part of your line text, and the line text will go through the loc team. They might make a change that affects presentation or even game logic, which means the shorter your tags are, the less likely it is that you'll have errors. Now, choices. The choice system is deceptively simple because there's a whole bunch of stuff that isn't immediately visible. Dredge has a notion of unavailable choices. So this comes from a feature built into Yarn Spinner where a choice can be made unavailable if it fails a certain test. So, for example, you might be thinking of, you can only say this if your charisma is over a certain score in Fallout, that kind of stuff. So unavailable might mean two things. It might mean don't show this option to the player at all, or it might mean show this option to the player, but don't let them choose it. Just imply you could have said this, but I'm not letting you because of other decisions you've made in the game. Now, you might want that to vary on a dialog-by-dialog basis, and in fact, Dredge does this. There is a command called show unavailable options that they added that changes state inside the dialog presenter to ensure that they're either showing or not showing disabled dialogues. So you can see here, for example, the line, "I'd like to pay off some of my debt," is only shown if you actually have debt. But there are other ones where you need to show it but make it inaccessible. Additionally, they wanted to make sure that choices that advance the game's story are very easy to see and very, very easy to recognize as this one. So choices that have a quest hashtag have a big, blinking, animated icon on them to go, yes, you want to click on this one. Content following a line should appear alongside that line in Dredge, and so they did this in a kind of a hacky way, which is they have a command called auto-resolve next line, which basically means insert a spacebar press immediately after the line finishes appearing, and that causes the options to appear, which I thought was very funny. They have an exit tag, which is the choice that is selected when you hit the B button on the controller. It's really, really simple, nice little things. Choices that have been revisited. So they want to make it clear to the player that they won't see some new content if they click on that option again. So what the dialog presenter does is it remembers the line ID of every single option it's ever been chosen, and then if it's shown again, show it dimmed. You can still choose it, but it's made very clear to the player that you aren't going to see anything new. Every single one of these was just a small customization to the built-in default one, which was really nice to see. As someone who designs these kinds of tools, it's nice that they didn't have to throw out everything and build their own. It was just a customized version of the built-in one. It wasn't all good. Size of text was a feedback point late in development where basically several people were saying the text is too small to read. The font size was originally designed at a size that was readable by the developers, a very common thing. But all the devs have fairly good eyesight. And they wanted to change it, but to do that would have meant redesigning every screen of UI. And so they had to ship it as is. The dev team told me that they consider that to be their biggest failure, which is a shame. Gameplay systems. So we've talked a lot about presenting content, presenting dialogue content, but Yarn Spinner is also, it's a programming language hiding behind a screenplay, and large chunks of the game's logic is actually written in the dialogue system. This is about as complicated as it got. So even though this is a very, very dense screen full of stuff, you can see this is the code that runs when we arrive at Greater Marrow, the starting island, where the game is deciding what content to show. And the reason why it's so complex is because the Dredge system wants to avoid overloading the player with too much content when they arrive at an island. There are many characters on those islands, and they might all want to talk to the player and say, hey, I have info about Quest. And if the player has to mash through 5 characters in a row who all want to say something, that gets very tiresome. So what the game does is it will show only a single NPC every time you dock. If you want to do another thing, you have to undock, go do something else, and then come back. So the game does not stack up things to talk to. The game also often needs to use stop dialogue and get the player to interact with something and then resume that dialogue. So a very common thing that the game needs is where you're talking to a character and they say, do you have that thing for me? Or I have a thing for you. And it'll show a thing called the inventory grid, which is this thing you can see on screen here now, where basically the game has paused dialogue and is waiting for the player to perform the appropriate action. This is an example of a different quest where the fishmonger is saying, I want like 3 fish, please give them to me, but if you don't have it all, you can do a partial delivery and come back later. So this show quest grid command that they wrote shows it, waits, suspends dialogue, and then when it returns, they call get last quest grid result, which returns 1 if the quest grid is satisfied. Otherwise, a line runs saying, well, come back when you have everything. Which I thought was a nice, neat little thing. It doesn't require that the player have everything in their inventory and deliver it all at once. Now, when you're using an off-the-shelf third-party system, you often don't need to use every single feature. I mentioned that Yarn Spinner has a bunch of different things in it, variables and functions and logic, but they actually didn't use Yarn Spinner variables very much at all because, well, I'll get to why in a second, but they use them only as temporary storage. Even though there are variables, they actually never write these to disk because the game state is not just dialogue variables. It's much better to keep all of the game state into one place. And the game state is, it's variables, but it's also position in the world, grid inventory stuff, weather, time of day, all this other stuff that is not relevant to the dialogue system and yet should be saved in the same place. So they decided to use custom commands to set state and use functions to read them, which raised my eyebrow as someone who designed those systems for use, but they said it works for them, so hey, cool. The dialogue systems interact with gameplay features a bunch. One of the coolest things that I liked a lot about Dredge is they have a system called temporal markers. The game is able to store information about, it can remember that an event happened and later come back and ask, how long ago did that happen? So at the start of the game, you can, the mayor will tell you, go and get a fish, and then come back, basically onboarding you onto the, like, this is a fishing game, you need to go get fish and come back. The player can immediately undock and then come back without a fish, and that's fine, no problem. The game won't react in any way because you're learning about the docking and undocking probably. The player can go out, get a fish, come back, great, cool, that's a happy path, and the story progresses. But if the player goes out, 8 hours pass in the game, and then they come back and they still don't have a fish, then that's an opportunity for the character to get mad at you, going, what are you doing? You're out there for ages. And so by creating this opportunity for the dialogue system to ask questions about the game state, it makes things really, really interesting for a writer. There's an extremely rich set of query functions. Is a certain quest in progress? Have we ever sold this kind of item? How many of the fish of one kind are we carrying in our inventory right now that are also in good condition? Commands for managing state progression and quest progression are available. So, like managing the overall state, going through this list of steps. There are world-affecting commands that they wrote. So stuff for controlling weather, for controlling time of day, or certain in-game triggers, like this cutscene here where a scientist is doing their evil monologue, and so lightning flashes in the background timed with their lines. Additionally, non-dialogue UI makes use of dialogue state because Yarn Spinner is able to keep track of which nodes have been visited before, and so destinations on screen get highlighted because the associated content from dialogue hasn't yet been run. So the only reason why this icon on the shipwright is appearing with a little exclamation mark is because the game knows that lines from the shipwright had never run. And so that's just hooked up in the inspector. So seeing the dialogue in gameplay exposed issues because the team found that while writing the dialogue initially was one thing, reading it back in the context of playing highlighted bad connections and janky exposition. So reading the linear document can't expose those same kind of issues. So they realize that what you need is not to focus on initial writing, but to focus your tool development on editing and rewriting and redrafting, because that will keep happening forever over the course of your production. So you'll write the first thing once, and then you'll spend another 90% of your time tweaking that content, which means make your tools very easy to iterate in. The localization flow was quite similar to what lots of other games have done. So they made use of Unity localization, which Jan Spinner supports, and the workflow was simply write the lines, export them as a spreadsheet, transfer that to Google Sheets. The Google Sheets were then sent off to the localizers who did their work, and then that was imported into Unity localization, which was then, of course, sent off to the game UI. A thing that they kept hitting again and again, and so I'm going to repeat it. Remember that control codes might get translated by your team. Make sure they don't. So that was a lot. Let's talk about some takeaways. So tools shape their products. Because it was easy to add narrative into Dredge, Dredge became a narrative game. Good tools expand the possibility space for interesting things in your game. Integrating dialogue systems with gameplay systems made both of them better. Because the dialogue is able to react to gameplay state, it makes the gameplay much more narratively rich. Localization is the most important thing in the universe, and it'll impact literally everything in your game, and you must account for it in your architecture. Serialization is the most important thing in the universe, and it'll impact literally everything in your game. You must account for it in your architecture. And there were some takeaways for us as well as tools developers. What we realized is our users often have much better feature ideas than we do. And so as a result, we have added into it better support for markup handling, better support for showing the right content at the right time, better support for asynchronous commands. And those are all now shipped in our most recent version. So thank you very, very much for listening. Huge thanks to Joel Mason from Black Salt, Marcel Vladison for the design, Tim Nugent and Braswell Vladison. I'm around for the rest of the conference. Scan this code, come chat to me. I'd love to chat about what else we did. And if you're watching this on the recording, you can scan this code and find out more about Jan Spinner in general. Thank you. So I think we have about 2.5 minutes for questions. Oh, 5 minutes, even better, great. So I think there's a roaming mic, so just raise your hand if you have a question and we'll get a mic to you. Yeah. Yeah, cool.
What engines is Jan Spinner compatible with?
We primarily design it for Unity. There is a version for Godot. We are working on a version for Unreal. And also there is a preliminary community port for several popular Rust ones as well. Yeah. So primarily Unity. We also, in the very early stages of a JavaScript-based one as well, designed for the web. So most of them. Yeah, most of them, but primarily Unity. Cool. Question? Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, you said that the Dredge team didn't specifically save any of the variables in Yarn Spinner. They were keeping track of that in a different system and serializing it from there. Does Yarn Spinner have a built-in means to serialize and save?
It does. In fact, it did at the time as well. But the reason why they didn't make use of ours was because they wanted to store kinds of data that can't really be stored as strings, numbers, and booleans. They wanted to store more complex data structures. And so they went, well, we're using our own existing system for these kinds of saves. May as well store these simpler variant values in there as well. So, yeah. Cool. No other questions? Cool. Well, oh, no, one more. Yeah.
Just because no one's asking, how do you assign line IDs for localization, and how do you make sure they stay unique for a huge script?
So You've activated something. So basically, you have a problem where if you have a whole bunch of different files, then they may be independent, and so the possibility for collision exists. You also want to make sure that as you're writing, you aren't causing like those edits to propagate out changes to later IDs. So what we do is we actually generate a hash of the line number, the name of the node that it was found in, the name of the file it was found in, but not the text of the line itself, which means that the line ID remains stable as you write it. And when you're done and you're ready to move on to like localization, you've got content lock. You can click a button inside our tools, and we'll actually rewrite your file to include the line IDs in a way that guarantees that they'll always be unique. We'll also like double check against existing hashtags from other files. But it turns out the full answer to your question is with great difficulty, but we handle it. So yeah, yeah.
If you have a couple of lines that are like tiny, one-word things, can they all get localized to the same thing in the spreadsheet so you don't have to spend as much money?
Yes. We call that a shadow line. So basically the idea is like you can have one line that gets like shadow copies of it throughout your dialogue. So a really common one was in the game Mass Effect, the line "I should go" is used again and again and again, and it's often the same recording. And so you can actually write it as "I should go" multiple times throughout your script, but they all reference the same entry in the string table. So yes.
Hey, I'm just curious what the style tags look like in terms of customization for Yarn Spinner. Is there quite a bit of depth of customization just built in, or do you have to build off quite a bit?
So all the parsing is done for you by our tool. So all you have to do is say, this is the name of the tag. Tell me where it's found. We'll tell you, and we'll also it wasn't visible inside the codes I showed, but you can add like properties and attributes and like additional information. So like all the parsing, all the hard work of reading the text is done for you, and it's up to you to decide what a tag is for. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Cool.
Everyone,
Thank you so much.
please.